Well, it is noon, so we're going to get started. Thank you guys very much for coming, all of you. I'm happy to see everyone. We are going to be talking about steampunk and anime today, which is a couple of my favorite pieces of subject matter. I'm actually going to move my chair back here a little bit because I just realized it's sort of right in my way. I am a huge fan of anime. I've been a fan of anime for a long time. I'm also a big fan of steampunk. I came into steampunk a little bit later than I did anime. Anime I've been watching more or less since I was about 8 or 9 years old. So roughly been into anime for about 30 years, which is a pretty long time, especially some of the stuff I started with. If you've never seen the old original cut of Voltron, definitely see it. It will make you appreciate everything you have now. Funny enough, some of the basics of steampunk I've been interested in for a long time. I've been a big fan of speculative fiction from the turn of the century, The Time Machine, H.G. Wells's works, things along that line. But I got into actual steampunk probably around 2010 when I did a convention down in Delaware and saw some really wonderful people walking around in these beautiful Victorian-style costumes or clothing, but with these really crazy sci-fi additions, devices and different things on them. And I went, what is that? That is cool. I want to know all about that. And fortunately, I have a friend who was into it, so she introduced me to the idea of doing steampunk. And so I thought, wow, this is kind of interesting because I really like the steampunk idea, and I like what I'm seeing here, and I really like anime, and hey, you know what? There's a lot of crossover between those two things that I never even realized were there. So after a couple of years, I decided to develop a steampunk and anime workshop. As I always say in the beginning of these things, I have a lecture. I can go on and on my own. Some of you guys have been to some of my other lectures, so you know how long I can go on my own. But I also like to make it a discussion more than a lecture. So please feel free, ask questions, make comments, be part of this. It's way more fun if we have a conversation. So the first thing you need to do when we're going to start talking about steampunk and anime is we need to define what is steampunk and what is anime. Does anyone here not know what anime is? All right, we're not going to get into that then. But I do know that there's some folks here that don't know necessarily what steampunk is. So let's talk a little bit about what those things are. So to start off with, there's actually several kinds of categories of this type of science fiction that actually have slightly different names to them. So we've all heard, or a lot of people have heard steampunk, but there's also a subgenre of that called diesel punk. There's a subgenre called clock punk. I've actually heard of atomic punk by this point. So steampunk seems to be splitting off into all these sort of areas. And they're all similar. They have some similarities between all of them. But the best kind of definition that I've heard of steampunk, and that can be also applied to these other ones, is steampunk was described as what the past would have looked like if it had happened sooner, which I really, really, really kind of like. So because of the fact that all of these things sort of exist in the same genre, we're going to use steampunk as shorthand. Even though some of the stuff we're going to talk about today will be clock punk or diesel punk, it's just a little bit easier to kind of group them all together there, even though they're not exactly the same thing. The easiest way to kind of think about steampunk is, although this isn't always the case, it tends to be set in the Victorian period, often Victorian England, although we're seeing some spread out from that. While most steampunk is still more or less in Victorian-era or sometimes into the Edwardian era, we're seeing a lot of steampunk now that's coming out that takes place in places other than Europe. So you're seeing steampunk that will come out of Africa, steampunk that comes out of Asia, steampunk that comes out of America. I've seen a couple of Native American steampunk costumers that try to mix those cultures together. So the idea of steampunk is even evolving as we speak, and there's a lot of other things coming into it. Obviously, from the term, the idea is that steampunk is a type of science fiction where all of the devices and all of the science fiction basically uses steam as its main source of power, which is, again, kind of something that came out of the Victorian era. One of the things that I love about steampunk, and it's not 100% true of all of it, but boy, a lot of it has this, is that steampunk has this wonderful idea, much in the same way as we were talking about with Star Trek yesterday, that science is really freaking cool, that science is going to bring us into the new frontier, that adventure, that there's no limitations, we get to go and find things, finding the next place that no other person has ever seen. We can't wait to get there, and we're going to invent stuff to get us there. Now, it's usually set, again, in this sort of turn-of-the-century idea, so a lot of it's the idea of exploration of parts of the world that at that time certain other areas had never seen, but sometimes it spills into things like the idea of going to space or going to the moon. There's some speculative fiction that comes out of the turn of the century that has that same feel. I'm sure many people are familiar with the old silent film, The Journey to the Moon. A lot of people have seen, at least if nothing else, you'll see the picture of the moon, the guy that's dressed as the moon with the rocket ship sticking out of his eye. That's where that comes from, and that's where that feeling comes from, the idea that we're going to go forward and find all this really cool stuff. Clockpunk has a lot of this same idea. The big differences between steampunk and clockpunk is, as it sounds, that the science in clockpunk is usually run by clockwork. These are a lot of clockwork punk will revolve around the idea of robots or AI, where you have to put a key in the back and wind them up. Kind of an interesting thing. Now, of course, this can be in the Victorian era, but some of this goes even further back. And there is, funny enough, some historical basis for this type of science fiction. There's a very famous discovery that was made in Da Vinci's notations, where he actually designed a clockwork man and built some prototypes of it with the idea of maybe, perhaps someday making clockwork soldiers back during the Renaissance. So there has been some experimentation in real life with this kind of idea way, way back. But we take it forward into science fiction, so maybe that, the idea that, that those clockwork soldiers might have actually worked if they had been built. And diesel punk goes forward from where steampunk leaves off. Diesel punk tends to go roughly around the early 1900s to a little bit before World War II. I've seen some diesel punk that kind of spills over in World War II, but usually it stays a little bit before that. Again, as the same as before, diesel becomes the main fuel source here. So this is a lot of things that come out of the idea of sort of World War I pilots, things along that line. And all of these, including some of the ones I didn't even mention, they tend to tell stories of these grand scale science fiction stories. And although they're not actually steampunk, H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, who are two of the biggest speculative fiction writers of the turn of the century, the last century I should say, if you read some of their stuff, you get an idea of what really inspired the idea of steampunk. Because a lot of the kind of work that they did had that same idea of adventure and the idea that science was going to bring people forward. But steampunk itself is actually a lot sooner than you think. As I said, the speculative fiction that sort of inspired it came out in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but it doesn't actually come into usage until the late 1980s. You don't see the word steampunk coming up as a genre until the late 1980s. And that comes from author K.W. Jester, using it as sort of a humorous way of describing a group of stories that were coming into being at the time that used the idea of steam-powered science fiction set during the Victorian era, which was pretty much the idea at the time. And that actually comes out of the idea that at that same time there was a genre. I'm not going to go into this heavily, that's actually more my Steampunk 101 panel, but it was named after the particular genre that was coming out at the same time called cyberpunk. Sorry, I blanked on that for a second. Too early in the morning. Definitely too early in the morning. Cyberpunk, which we all have seen whether we know it or not, cyberpunk was a type of science fiction that had this idea that the future was going to be really dark and grim. Things were not going to be terribly great. It's very dystopian. Although, again, this isn't 100%. There's some cheerful cyberpunk stories, but not bloody many of them. It doesn't tend to be part of cyberpunk. We have all seen some cyberpunk. Particularly within the last 1999, I believe, is when this hit the theaters. Can anyone think of the movie I'm thinking of? I'll give you a hint. I know Kung Fu. Whoa.
Matrix.
Thank you, The Matrix. The Matrix is a brilliant example of cyberpunk. It is the idea that we are going to be connected to our machines so much that they literally jack into the back of our heads, that the machines will turn against us and hold us prisoner, and that we will have to rebel against our own creations in order to take our world back. Those are very, very cyberpunk ideas. That's very cyberpunk.
Would you consider Fifth Element cyberpunk?
Ah, good question. I don't know if I would consider it straight out cyberpunk because it's not quite as dystopian, and the kind of dystopian part of it comes from a force from outside of us rather than inside. So a really big thing of cyberpunk is our own science creations will destroy us until we destroy them. The threat in the fifth element comes from outside of us. It's an alien force that's coming in. But I would say that there's definitely some cyberpunk overtones to it. There's some things in it that were obviously inspired by cyberpunk. I'm not sure it's an exact translation, though, to be completely honest with you.
Okay.
And when they decided to use the word steampunk, it became kind of a joke, to say, well, this science fiction is different from cyberpunk. And again, the biggest difference between the steampunk and the cyberpunk, well, the two biggest ones, is that steampunk is science fiction, again, that's set more in the past, but it's also that feeling of grandness and adventure, and that science is a good thing, that science is good for us. So that sort of set it apart. Very quickly, you've seen some steampunk stuff most likely. There's novels that have come out, there's comics that have come out. If anyone saw the Will Smith Wild Wild West, it's not a great movie, but it's a great example of steampunk. Giant spiders that have steam and blow fire and stuff. It is a lot of fun. All the inventions that are steampunk. If anyone in the room is a fan of Avatar, particularly The Legend of Korra, although there is some stuff in Avatar: The Last Airbender that's definitely steampunk inspired, that also had some very heavy steampunk overtones to it. And steampunk has become very, very popular with both sort of science fiction fans and cosplayers, particularly with the idea of adapting steampunk into other forms of science fiction. These are two of my favorites, the steampunk Star Wars at the top and the steampunk X-Men at the bottom. And one of the lovely things about steampunk itself is that it's very easy to adapt it with other forms of fandom. So you can have, which I didn't do this morning because again I was very tired and decided t-shirt day was the way to go. I have a steampunk librarian getup that I do sometimes wear when I do these panels, and that is a completely original outfit with a kind of an original character background. If people actually ask me who I am, I have a whole history I made up, but it's my character. It's almost like when you do an RPG and you create a character. But you can also take steampunk and adapt it into things you already like. So as we're seeing here, I've seen steampunk Ghostbusters, people that decide to mix those two things. So steampunk's very versatile. You can use it in other ways and kind of put things together. Both comics, DC and Marvel have both done sort of what-if comics, extra comics that aren't part of the main line, where they said, well, what if, the Justice League existed in the late 1800s? What if they were a steampunk group? What would happen then? So you can really adapt it into different ways and use it, which is a lot of fun. So now we have a basic idea of what steampunk is. The question goes, what does science fiction based on steam power that usually is set in the English Victorian era have to do with Japan? That's a pretty good question. Why would the Japanese suddenly go, ooh, steampunk, that seems like kind of a cool thing? Well, this goes back, amongst other things, into a little bit of history. The Japanese, without going into an entire lecture on Japanese history, I'm going to give you the very basics, but definitely look some of this stuff up because it's really interesting. The Japanese, for many hundreds of years, were pretty much closed to the West. They were not very friendly. They didn't really want to have influence or outside attachments to anyone else. But during the mid to late 1800s, in an era called the Meiji era, they opened their doors finally for trade with Western countries. And when that happened, they went nuts for Victorian stuff. Having Victorian stuff became a status symbol, and they became fascinated, particularly with English Victorian stuff, but also from other parts of Europe. For one thing, it was the first time the Japanese had a railway system. They actually put a railway system in at the time, steam-powered trains, and they were fascinated by this whole idea to get around the country. But fashion itself became a huge deal. This is a silk print from 1894 that shows some Japanese nobles dressed in Western Victorian fashion. Now, the interesting thing I love about this is if you look at the patterns and some of the different things that are done at the time, the fashion is very Victorian, where the patterns in the cloth are very obviously Japanese descent. These are same patterns and same kind of cloth that they would use in kimonos and other traditional Japanese clothing. And this went both ways. The Victorians in England went nuts for Asian stuff, particularly Japanese stuff. So at that time period in the Meiji era, you start seeing a lot of Victorian fashion back in England that is also featuring very distinct patterns that come out of Japanese culture and some other Asian cultures. Japan and China were the two big ones, but there were some other ones that came into there too. And this was mostly because of a guy named Emperor Meiji, who the whole era is named after. These are photos that were taken of himself and his empress, also dressed in Western clothing from that time period. And he was just fascinated by this whole idea. So he brings in these sort of Western influences that never quite go away. While they don't necessarily become part of Japanese culture permanently, they still have a fascination with it. And this is a fascination we still see today. There's this form of music in Japan called visual kai that a lot of their costuming in these bands are very Victorian based. There's some variations. Some of them look a little more like the 1700s, the King Louis XIV and things like that. But there's some very obvious Victorian influences here. Strange Artifact is another one to give you an idea. But a lot of these visual kai bands use Victorian fashion and steampunk style fashion as part of their act. There's also an entire fashion movement in Japan that some of you guys might be familiar with that definitely taps into the Victorian. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Oh, I'm surprised. Usually someone knows. All right, good. Well, this will be exciting for all of us then. So this is a style of clothing called, it's a terrible name. I don't know why they call it this, but it is what it is. It's called Lolita. It is not what you think when you hear that term if you know the book Lolita. I have a sneaky suspicion it was a mistranslation. The Japanese didn't actually know what that was until it was too late. However, whatever it is, Lolita is a particular kind of fashion where usually young women, although there is some male Lolita fashion as well, young women dress in these very Victorian, almost frilly kind of, you look almost like a China doll. Usually modeled after very young child's Victorian clothing, so you see a lot of ruffles. And depending on the different style, it can look very different. For example, I have two styles here. The ladies in pink are what's referred to as Sweet Lolita, and Sweet Lolita tends to be very ruffly and very cheerful and very doll-like. The two young ladies in the dark clothing is Gothic Lolita, and that tends to be a Lolita style, but done in a much more Gothic way. I have an excellent friend of mine in Massachusetts who's a Goth Lolita, who dresses in all of these things, and she makes her own jewelry out of small animal skulls. She actually gets bones and things that she'll find in the woods and make jewelry out of them when she finds animals. She also has a couple of suppliers, so I don't ask questions, but gorgeous jewelry, a little creepy. And there's many other variations on this. Here are a couple of different versions. There's also some fashion that comes out of the Lolita scene that isn't technically Lolita, but is much closer to steampunk. The older couple in the end with the top hat is an example of this. And Lolita can be worn by anyone, but it tends to be a fashion used by much younger people, teen to early 20s. But some of the sort of Victorian fashion is still kind of spilling over into older crowds in Japan and kind of being used with older people. And here's a few other fashion photos from that same time period. I'm particularly fond of that gentleman there with the top hat and the cane. I think that's pretty awesome. And of course, you know, as I said, with the Lolita, some of these steampunk elements come into even the Lolita, even if it's not straight out. So we have this fascination with Victorian West. We also have a fascination with science fiction. Anime and science fiction have been a partnership for a very long time, which is not terribly surprising if you consider the fact that the Japanese culture and the country has been on the cutting edge of technology for a very long time. That can be debated now. China's catching up with a lot of stuff, and there's other areas of the world. But particularly through the 70s and the 80s, if you wanted something electronic, you pretty much went to Japan, maybe even into the 90s, honestly. And their fiction reflects this. A lot of anime is science fiction based. They're a very technological-oriented society. And so both of these things come together with this idea of having science fiction and anime, but wanting to do something different with it. So what examples do we have of this? Well, let's talk about some anime that has some steampunk or steampunk influences. You can tell it's having a little bit of fun with PowerPoint, right? Galaxy Express 999 is from 1979, and this is one of the first examples where we see some steampunk influences. First of all, much of the fashion of the character is very steampunk influence. While I wouldn't say it's exactly Victorian, it definitely has a reminiscent of a lot of Victorian stuff, particularly the uniforms that the young boy wears and some of the other characters. The big thing that stands out, however, is the mode of transportation. This is a science fiction anime about a boy that goes on an adventure all around the galaxy through all these episodes, and his mode of transportation is a steam train that moves through space planet to planet. Now, they don't bother to explain how this happens. There's no track. He just kind of flies through space magically. So perhaps we could call this also a little bit of fantasy. But it definitely is heavily influenced by this idea of steam, and it's all steam-powered. So it's heavily influenced by this idea of steam-powered technology with a little bit of fantasy thrown in and some really excellent Victorian fashion. So this is one of the very first examples. Now, there's more modern versions of Galaxy Express. There's been several other series that have come out much more recently than 1979, but this is the first time. Then we get into something very interesting about 1982, a series that was a French and Japanese partnership when they put out this animated series. And to be completely honest with you, I'm not sure which category this exactly falls into, because it's not really steampunk. It's definitely not clockpunk. I would probably say, if nothing else, I'd call it solar punk, but I'm not really sure that that's a thing, so we may have to kind of leave this in the general punk category. And this is The Mysterious Cities of Gold in 1982. Now, this is a really interesting show for a lot of reasons. First of all, it uses history as a basis, and I mean a loose basis. It kind of goes off on its own thing. But the entire series pretty much happens in South America and Mexico during the time of the conquistadors. And the whole story is about these Spanish explorers that come over, they have a young boy with them, they meet some other people, they go on this adventure looking for these cities of gold, which is real history. This actually happened. Now, the TV show goes on its own direction with it. It goes into very fantastical areas with it. But the very, very, very basics is based on real history. In fact, one of the main characters, the little Spanish boy whose name is Esteban, was actually a real person. Now, he was not a little boy, and he actually was not from Spain. He was from the Caribbean, and he was actually the slave of one of the conquistadors at the time. So they definitely adapt his story, but they know he existed at the time because of diary entries and paperwork that was left over and passed down that we have as historical record. So they're definitely taking some pretty big liberties here. But these people, some of these people were real people. And the steampunk or solar punk elements come in when they actually start finding all of these relics during the different cities of gold. Turns out that, much like a lot of science fiction, they've decided that the Native Americans that lived down there were actually helped out by a bunch of aliens. If you guys watch the History Channel, this will sound familiar. And not a very good History Channel, but beside the point. They're helped out by aliens, and it turns out that a lot of the stuff down there turns out to be hidden technology. So in the first part of the first season, they find a giant condor that seems to be a big statue until they climb inside of it, and then turns out to be a solar-powered jet plane. They also have a ship that does exactly the same thing. At the end of the series, it turns out that there's an actual nuclear reactor in the middle of one of the pyramids that they have to deal with. It gets pretty out there. But it's definitely kind of that idea of taking science and science fiction, pretty loose science, but still science, and mixing it in with history and sort of this older setting. Not surprisingly, in 1983, we get one that was out of one of the early studios called Around the World with Wily Fogg, which is very, very loosely based on Around the World in 80 Days, which is a very famous speculative fiction story. There are a lot of steampunk elements to this, particularly with the gadgets and the machines that help him get around the world. He does go on in an official steam train, but there's also a steam-powered plane, there's a steam-powered hot air balloon that helps him get across one point. Excuse me. So there's a lot of sort of steampunk sci-fi going on within the actual devices that they use. And not too long afterwards, coming from Miyazaki's studios, Sherlock Hound hits the airwaves between 1984 and 1985. And of course, being set in Victorian England, dealing with obviously Sherlock Holmes as a crime-solving dog, go figure. He also has an entire group of various devices, and he has to fight against some steam-powered inventions by villains, and so we have this whole sort of technology, steam technology over it. Mostly it's villains making these things, although he does have a few devices himself. And again, not too surprisingly, we'll see a pattern here, because this is one of the first things Miyazaki's. I actually don't believe this was officially Miyazaki's studio. They didn't have the studio quite together yet, but it's the same basic team that Miyazaki worked with. And you'll see a pattern. Miyazaki is very fond of steampunk. He brings a lot of steampunk elements into his films. And of course, in the same year, we see Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind, which again has many, many devices and many, many kind of plot points that are based around the idea of steam or futuristic technology. Now, this is a little bit interesting because the implication of the film is it's actually in the future, that there's been a huge Holocaust type, nuclear Holocaust type event, and that they're starting over from scratch. So it technically isn't in the past, but the technology and the way that they're using things makes it set up as if it was in the past. So I count it because I think the way the society is set up. Not surprisingly, 2 years later, he comes out with Castle in the Sky. If you haven't seen Castle in the Sky, I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite Miyazaki movies of all times. And in Castle in the Sky, we see a couple of things that come up into steampunk fiction all the time. So again, we have steam-powered and diesel-powered flying machines. Particularly, I love the planes because they're developed to make them look like dragonflies. They have these wings that kind of do this. We have robots that run on steam and other things that are ancient creations but have this sort of technology. But they also have something in here that we steampunk folks just love. And I don't know why that is exactly, we just do. I'll give you a hint if you can't guess. It has to do with flying machines, but it also has to do with rogues. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? No? All right. We love us some air pirates. We love air pirates. Air pirates are a big deal in steampunk. I just think they're fun. I think that's why a lot of steampunk people like them. But you will constantly see airship pirates or airship pilots that maybe are sort of more Han Solo-ish, but definitely pirates all the time in steampunk literature and steampunk costuming. And there's a wonderful group of bumbling air pirates in this movie that I think is one of the best examples of the genre ever. So definitely see it. You'll get a really nice sense of some of these sorts of things. Nadia, the Secret of Blue Water comes out in 1990, and not surprising, is extremely loosely based on 30,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So it's already been inspired by Victorian speculative fiction. Again, a lot of the devices in it are steampunk-style devices powered by steam, particularly the Nautilus, which is the giant submarine they travel around in. It also brings another trope in that's not quite as popular in steampunk, but I do see it coming up more and more. For some reason, a lot of steampunk is also fascinated with the idea of lost continents like Atlantis. You'll see a lot of steampunk stories that have explorers looking for places like that, which again taps directly into that idea of exploration is really cool. We're going to build these neat machines and they're going to take us places we've never seen before. So I think that's where that kind of comes out of. It's a wonderful series. I want to say it's 24 episodes. It's also one of those series that can be watched by an entire family. It's kid-friendly, but it's not dumbed down for kids. So adults can watch it too. I'm 38. It's one of my favorites still. I love this one because, again, it has that same feeling. The Spirit of Wonder is from 1992, and this is a series of short anime stories that all take place around the idea of a boarding house that has mad scientists staying there. And these mad scientists constantly get into trouble. And all of their creations are steampunk-style creations, or at the very least, diesel-punk-style creations. One of my personal favorites is a shrink ray that's invented by one of the scientists that accidentally gets fired at and hits the woman that owns the boarding house, and every day she goes down by a certain percentage, and they're trying to figure out how to reverse it. It's a wonderful, really funny story. It has that kind of crazy, over-the-top sci-fi feel to it, very vintage. There's also another set of stories where a group of guys decide to do an explorers club and create a steampunk-style rocket ship that's made out of an old barrel, an old beer barrel and some other stuff, and they literally go to the moon in it with a balloon attached to it. It's very reminiscent of Journey to the Moon, the silent film. Really, really wonderful stuff, done in the spirit of not just wonder, but the spirit of fun. It's very funny, it's very entertaining. I really highly recommend it. Vision of Escaflowne from 1996. This is kind of interesting because at first it doesn't really seem to have much to do with steampunk. It is a alternate universe story. A girl from our world gets taken into a different world. Very common anime trope. This happens all the time. I sometimes think that if you're a Japanese girl between the ages of 13 and 16, you need to keep a bag packed at any moment because you might just end up in some other universe. But it's a very interesting way where they sort of set this whole idea up where it's a very medieval style society. But it turns out they have mech. They have giant robots that fight each other. One that turns into a dragon type mech, which is kind of interesting. While they're powered by dragon hearts rather than actual steam, there's sort of a look to them that's very, very reminiscent of steampunk. It's sort of this idea of using basic technology to figure out how would you make a giant robot if all you had was a forge and you were kind of in this medieval society. Wonderful series. I highly recommend it. I will say do not, if you can avoid it by any cost, do not see the Fox Kids version of it. They chopped it apart horribly. Definitely get the original version. It's much, much better. There's actually a film based on it, too, that's sort of a retelling of the story in a more condensed way. It's not terrible. I like the series much better because it gets a chance to get into a lot more. But if you can't find the series and you can find the movie's not too bad. It gives you a good idea. Sakura Wars from 1997 is a lot of fun because it's a story about a group of young women who are posing as actors in a theater in Japan who are secretly working for the Japanese government at the turn of the century to defend the homeland by piloting giant steam-powered mechs. It's kind of a weird combination of almost magical girl and mech anime at the same time. Really, really fun. But the mechs are definitely steampunk. They're steam-powered, they're designed to look very Victorian, and of course the girls themselves coming out of that time period, including a young lady who is not Japanese, she's actually from France, who is very Lolita. She's very sweet Lolita, so you get some of that fashion in there as well. I'm not going to get too heavily into Final Fantasy because most of their stuff is kind of just touches on steampunk, but Final Fantasy in general, even the video games, usually has some kind of steampunk overtone. If nothing else, every single Final Fantasy game has a very steampunk-ish airship in it. Although the design changes slightly from game to game, so some of them are much more steampunk than others. But it's definitely sort of an inspiration for steampunk. And then, of course, you get Steam Detective from 1998, which you almost can't not put in here because it's right in the title. And this, of course, is a Victorian-era detective show. As you can see in the background, there's a giant steam-powered mech that helps them out. But also some of that sort of Victorian setting and a lot of the actual technology that they use is very steampunk. I'm only going to touch on Trigun just for a minute because, again, the Trigun stuff is a little more aesthetic. But Trigun takes place on a planet where a lot of the technology is sort of steam or diesel powered. It's also a pretty good example of anime that uses something else that's very popular with steampunk, and that is, other than pirates, we love steampunk cowboys, which is why it's too bad Wild Wild West wasn't very good. We love us some steampunk cowboys, and while these guys aren't straight out cowboys, this is also a series that's very heavily influenced by the idea of cowboy films. So it's this kind of interesting combination between science fiction, some steampunk, and some cowboys. The Big O from 1999. This is most definitely a diesel punk inspired anime. For one thing, the actual decor and the setting is very 1920s, early 1930s. So it has an Art Deco look to it that's very popular with diesel punk. Also, the giant robot is very obviously diesel powered. And there's kind of a very interesting setting where they kind of give that whole, it almost gives you the same feeling as the old film Metropolis, which is a very famous diesel, it wasn't a diesel punk film itself, but it's another inspiration that kind of ends up being part of diesel punk much later on. Excuse me, I highly recommend that one as well. Blue Submarine number 6 in 2000 is, again, very, very, very loosely touches on 30,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Though in this version it is very loose. Nadi is actually much more loyal to it. But there are devices in this too that kind of give across that diesel punk feeling. Although the story itself I would not actually say is steampunk. So let's move on to one I would say is definitely diesel punk. Read or Die in 2001. If you have not seen this, I highly recommend it. I'm a librarian though, so I'm a little biased. This whole thing is a goof on multiple different genres. For one thing, it has the main character is a librarian for the British Library who has superpowers. She can make paper do whatever she wants. But there's also a sort of a goof on James Bond and spy films in here. And it also has a very heavy diesel punk overtone, particularly certain ones of the villains. The gentleman we see here with the strange box on his back covered in electricity is a clone of Nikolai Tesla. Who's also a big diesel punk sort of hero, science hero. If you read The Oatmeal, you'll know much about him. And if you don't, read The Oatmeal. It's definitely worth it. But of course, there's other moments too. There's the gentleman who runs the organization, and when he comes out, he's in his big steam-powered wheelchair and comes out and talks, and he has a big steampunk-style cybernetic implants and things like that. So the stylistic stuff is definitely there. And not surprising, since we just talked about it a minute ago, Metropolis, which was put out in 2001, is an anime that has a really interesting history. The entire anime is very diesel punk, and it's also very Art Deco as well. And Metropolis is really interesting because if anyone knows your film history, Metropolis was actually a silent film that came out, I want to say in 1922, but don't quote me on that. I could be misremembering my dates. But when they created the anime and the manga Metropolis, this was created off the idea that there's a very famous, iconic movie poster that came out from Metropolis that you've probably seen even if you didn't realize it was for the movie. And it's a robotic woman, all in silver, with this very distinct haircut, who's sort of standing there looking at the camera, very deadpan. She has a very, almost like, she's actually very reminiscent of C-3PO in a weird way. You can see where that might have influenced George Lucas as well. But anyway, it's a very iconic poster, and there's a model of the city that is involved in the movie kind of at her feet. And when they made the manga and the anime, they never actually saw the movie Metropolis. They never watched the silent film. They simply wrote a story based off of that image from the new movie poster. So Metropolis, the anime, and Metropolis, the film, are very different stories. The interesting thing about this is that the themes are exceedingly similar. There's lots of stuff in both of these that touch on each other just based off of this one image. So I find it really interesting that despite not having seen the movie at all, there's something about that image, that diesel punk style image, that gets across a lot of the same ideas. This is one of my personal favorites, actually. Last Exile in 2003. This is a dramatic sort of airship style anime. There's a lot of flying and daring do. It's a grand adventure that two of the characters go on. And all of the airships are styled around the idea of diesel punk style airships. Everything in this is diesel punk. Except for one thing that I find very interesting. During the course of the anime, you find out that there's actually a war going on. That there's factions that are warring with each other. And in the very first episode, you see, and you can see the picture here in the lower right-hand corner, two groups of soldiers on the deck of two different airships that get together, and they have these long rifles, and they start firing at each other. It's a very, it actually reminds me of some images that you see of British military forces from the late 1800s in places like India and things like that.
You closed the door.
Yeah, there was a lot of noise out in the hallway. Thank you, hon. So the uniforms particularly are very reminiscent of this. But the interesting thing is when they line up to fire their rifles at each other, instead of just having rifles, they actually have tubes that come out of the back of them, and they hook them into a machine, and when they fire off the rifles, a huge burst of steam comes out on both sides. They're steam-powered rifles. It's what actually propels the bullets at each other. So it's this really interesting combination of a few pieces of steampunk technology paired up with a bunch of different pieces of diesel punk technology. And the style, especially with the clothing and stuff, the style of their clothing is sort of runs a gauntlet between some obviously Victorian-inspired stuff all the way up to maybe the very early 1920s. So it's this mismatch of a whole bunch of different historical periods. Some of you guys might be familiar with this one. Anyone know Full Metal Alchemist? That's a pretty famous one. All right, cool. Full Metal Alchemist, while I would not call it a straight-out steampunk anime, there are some steampunk elements to it. First of all, the automail and some of the other sort of sci-fi tech that we see there is very reminiscent of certain types of steampunk. Of course, we also see the fact that a lot of their travels are by train, which is all steam. And there's some suggestion that it's kind of, again, this sort of time inspired by this time period that has multiple elements, but certain parts of the costuming, certain parts of how the towns look are obviously very heavily influenced by Victorian and Edwardian culture. So it's this really interesting, again, mismatch of a whole bunch of things that they threw into the same series. Japanese seem to like doing that quite a bit. And then, of course, we're back to Miyazaki, not surprising. Howl's Moving Castle in 2004. Wonderful Victorian-based story about a young woman who has to deal with a sorcerer who turns out to be very different than what you think. His actual moving castle is a steampunk wonder. There's steam and smoke and all sorts of things coming out of it. Now, granted, it's powered by magic, sort of, but there's parts of it that are powered by steam. And a lot of the airships in the show, in the film, are also obviously very heavily influenced by dieselpunk designs. This is a fantastic anime, and if you haven't seen it, I highly, highly recommend it. So there is a famous film that came out of Japan in the 1960s. It's a Kurosawa film called The Seven Samurai. If you have not seen the film, I highly recommend it. If you want to understand a little bit about Japanese history, while it's a fictional film, it gives the appearance and the feel of that historical period very well. And basically, The Seven Samurai is the story of a group of samurai, wandering samurai, ronin, I guess you'd call them, who come across a village who's being sort of preyed upon by a group of bandits, and they have no way to fight back. And these seven samurai decide to stay and defend the village, and what happens to them after that. It's a very long movie. It's about 3.5 hours long. It's black and white. There's long periods of stillness and all kinds of weird stuff in it, but it's a brilliant film. Now, someone watched this movie, one of the creators watched this movie and thought, wow, this is a really great movie. You know what would be even better? If this was a sci-fi epic adventure with steampunk robots. We totally need to do this. It sounds crazy, but it works. It's a different feel, it's a different type of story, but there's reminiscent parts that touch from both the film and the anime that I really like. And of course, one of the main characters, our friend here that we can see in the full samurai armor, is not in fact in full samurai armor, that's his body. He's so desperate to become a samurai that he literally allows them to implant his brain in a steam-powered cybernetic samurai cyborg body. To the point that I love where the two little, the piece that comes off the top of his helmet that looks like very, it's very stylized, you see that in a lot of samurai helmets, actually are exhaust ports, and when he gets angry, steam comes out of both of them as he's standing there. Now, I don't want to give the wrong impression, a lot of this anime is actually very dramatic and sad, but there's wonderful moments of comedy in it that balance it out very well, and he's actually one of the main characters that helps to bring some of that comedic feel to it. But it's very tragic, but it's very beautiful, so I really, really highly recommend it. The funny thing about it too is that, again, it mixes some very futuristic type tech with some steampunk tech at the same time. And in 2004, we get a movie called Steam Boy, which has to be a steampunk movie because, again, you don't call it Steam Boy and not have it as steampunk. It's the story of a young man in Victorian England who discovers a kind of super-powered ball that creates steam that's an endless energy source, basically. And the bad guys are trying to get a hold of it, and there's some overtones of fascism, and they might be kind of getting involved with Nazis. So there's a little bit of that kind of Rocketeer style, we have to keep this away from the bad guys idea. But it's a wonderful, wonderful steampunk piece. Also with a little bit of dieselpunk overtone, although most of the stuff is actually powered by steam. The setting is slightly later than what we're used to with steampunk. I'd say it's probably more like the 19-teens than really Victorian-era. But a lot of fun, and I really highly recommend it. Although there's this really creepy steampunk carousel at one point that's a little like the horses have these glass eyes that kind of look at you and you kind of go, I'm not going to sleep too well tonight. De Grey Man from 2006. De Grey Man, while again not completely steampunk, it has a time period that's very similar to Victorian time, and there are some devices in it that are steam. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this one because I think it just touches on steampunk. Now here's something that's a little bit unusual. Most people do not think of this one when you think steampunk, and I normally wouldn't have either. First of all, it's actually dieselpunk, but beside the point. So, most of this anime seems to be set in a world... Well, actually, we don't know where it's set exactly. Is anyone here not familiar with Attack on Titan? Okay. So the basic story, and I'm just going to give you the really basic overview. The basic story is that at some point, somewhere, somehow, we don't really know what any of these are, the world exists behind a set of walls. And the reason for this is that outside of the walls are these giant things that in the English dub are called titans. And the titans are these giant, anything from 11 or 12 feet tall if they're really tiny, to 40 or 50 or 60 feet tall or 100 feet tall. Some of them are so big they're ridiculous. They're like tall skyscrapers. They're humanoid creatures that don't seem to feel any pain or have any emotions. They have one mode and one mode only. They see a human being, they go, "You look like a snack," scoop you up and eat you alive. It's pretty gruesome. Although I will give you that it's definitely a mature anime. There are some moments in it that are very bloody and gory, but they're few and far between, and they only use it for very specific purposes to get across how grave some of this stuff is. So I'm pretty squeamish about blood and guts, but I liked it a lot. So humanity is hiding behind these walls because they're trying to keep these creatures out that are trying to eat them, and of course this is limiting to what they can do. So these groups of people volunteer within the ranks of the humans hiding out, and they are trained to basically take these big giant swords and fight these things, and they figure out a way to kind of help fight them. And one of the ways that they actually do this is they have these devices that are they keep their swords in them, but they're strapped to them. And they have lines, much like Spider-Man. They throw these lines out and swing around to try to hit this thing. But they're also powered by these sort of diesel capsules that send out these sprays of, I'm not sure if they're like steam exactly, but air or force that allows them to get an extra swing in. If you run out of gas, you're in big trouble. You're going to probably get eaten. And it's very, very diesel-punk type technology. They do talk about it as gasoline or diesel, so it's definitely not steam-powered. But it's a really interesting, strange thing to come in the middle of all of this, because up until that point, we pretty much see the society as being almost medieval. It's almost gone back to, thatched huts and ladies in long dresses and aprons. So it's a very interesting combination of different things, but I really like the idea that out of nowhere in this very bizarre anime, we suddenly get this little piece of diesel technology that helps these people fight these monsters. Season 1 has already been out. We're waiting for season 2 to come out. The manga's gotten a little bit further than the anime. There's still a lot of questions about what these things are, although I haven't quite read the last couple of manga, so maybe they've answered that question just yet, although I have a sneaky suspicion of what they are because of some things that have happened. But anyway, part of the mystery is, what are the Titans, where did they come from, how did this happen, and how do we stop them? But the other kind of interesting thing is that they never really explain to you where you are. Is this our world, and then something awful happens and now it's in the future? Is this another planet? Are we on a spaceship that we think is a planet and turns out, we have no idea. We really have no idea. So it's a really great anime, but it has that really wonderful moment of that, using that diesel punk technology. Now, I have a small section at the end of this here that I like to call Not Quite Anime, the Runners-Up. Now, I would like to explain just momentarily that, as we talked about yesterday in Anime 101, what is anime is a very interesting question these days. Because the definition is changing, it's evolving. I completely forgot to look up the guy's name, but there was one anime director that was being interviewed a couple of years ago, and when they asked him about sort of the evolving idea of what anime was, he said, well, I'll tell you what one of my favorite anime is. One of my favorite anime is The Boondocks. Now, I don't know if you guys, is anyone familiar with The Boondocks? Right. Okay, so this is an Adult Swim show that's based off an American comic I think actually there are several studios that work on the animation, but at least one of the studios is American. It's all American voice actors. It's all written in English. It's not Japanese at all. It's about an African-American family that lives in a suburb, gets a nice house and lives in the suburb, and it's very political, and it's very topical, and it talks about racism, and it's exceedingly funny. But it's not at all what we would call anime, and yet here we have this anime director saying, that's my favorite anime, because one of the characters is heavily influenced by anime. So some of the things he does in the series you can see is influenced by anime characters. Some of the art styles are influenced by anime characters. There's a brilliant opening sequence for the show that's obviously very heavily influenced by things like Samurai Champloo. So it's really hard these days to say exactly what anime is because we have this discussion going on. But I'm going to go with a little more traditional way of thinking of anime, where for this section, we're going to call anime anything that wasn't created pretty much exclusively in Japan, although even that's a little bit argumentative these days. So let's have a look. 1985 to 1987, Spartacus and the Sun Beneath the Sea. This was a show, it was actually a French production, although there were a few Japanese animators that worked on it, that talks about a hidden sort of a hidden world in the core of the earth. These two kids go into a cave and accidentally fall down a hole and find out there's an entire world in the center of our earth, and they need to help the inhabitants. Which, one thing, is a very common trope with speculative fiction from the turn of the century. Journey to the Center of the Earth is one of the most famous sci-fi books from the late 1800s. Now, they don't have dinosaurs. For some reason, all of those speculative fiction love to have dinosaurs in the center of the Earth. I don't know why. But it's definitely reminiscent of all of that kind of stuff. And the tech itself is a very sort of a weird combination of very futuristic sci-fi and some sort of steam or diesel punk inspired stuff. So there's a combination there. It is very old. It is very hard to get a hold of. You probably can find some clips on YouTube, but they never had a DVD release. The other thing I should add that was part of this is that it also has sky pirates as some of the bad guys. They're very comedic. In fact, one of the weird things about the show that I kind of love from when I was a kid was that they have a habit of breaking into a random music video. It's the same one every time. They do the exact same musical number where the pirates sing about how awful and evil and terrible they are, and they're going to take over your house and make your mom do their dishes, you know, that kind of thing. It's very, very weird, but you can probably find clips online. As I understand, it's easier to find the French clips with subtitles versus actually finding the English dub. And if you ever get on Jeopardy and need to know, the English dub from '85 was the theme song was sung by Menudo, featuring our very own Ricky Martin when he was still part of that band. So just so you know, if that ever comes up on Jeopardy. Avatar: The Last Airbender and also The Legend of Korra, particularly The Legend of Korra. That from 2005 to 2008 for the first series, and 2012, actually I think it just ended last year if I remember correctly. Both of these shows had some steampunk overviews, but Korra especially had a lot of steampunk tech in it. The airships, the car that they go driving around in a couple of episodes. So a lot of the tech is there, and it's this kind of interesting idea of taking the fantasy of the airbenders or the benders and going forward with how would you have technology in that world. And one of the things that I really love about the idea of sharing steampunk and Victorian culture along with the Japanese is, if nothing else, we both can enjoy a good tea party. Tea is very important in Japanese culture. It was also very important in civilized Victorian culture, not surprisingly. And I think that's something that we share back and forth.